Right, so you guys are probably as sick of hearing about this as I am. It is, however, incredibly important to talk about because one of the key things that the Destiny player base is discussing right now is the power grind in Edge of Fate and how ridiculously slow it feels overall. Some players who really enjoy the grind actually disagree with this sentiment at the moment, which is, of course, totally fair. However, the one thing we can't ignore is the impact that the new systems in the game are actually having on player numbers. As Kujay shared a few days back, player drop-off 9 days after the release of Edge of Fate is actually worse than Episode Heresy an entire month after it launched. So whether you like the power grind or not, whether you agree with the sentiment that what is ultimately the grind for higher tier rewards is actually putting players off, there is a simple reality where the numbers speak for themselves, right? And that's why I think now that Bungie have discussed many of the bugs in Edge of Fate, they've started to address some of the issues with armor stats, reward tiers in the raid, and all of that kind of stuff. I think the next thing that has to be on their priority list, at the very least in terms of discussion, is the power grind, and more specifically, in my opinion, the relationship between the power grind and high tiers of rewards. So, looking at the equation right now, the portal is of course limited in terms of the activities we can actually play, but grinding inside of the portal for high power is absolutely necessary if you want good loot. As we've discussed, the power grind is pretty slow. It comes down to personal preference whether you like that level of grind or not. After having a couple of weeks, I'm moving to a position where having a big power grind isn't necessarily the worst component right now. However, players having a significant desire for tier 4 or 5 loot, which doesn't really happen until you're close to the end of the power band, I think is actually becoming the more significant problem. For the average Destiny player, I think at the moment it's creating a sense that there's a lot of wasted time and wasted drops along the way through the power climb, and players are simply sharding tier 2 and even tier 3 loot because they want the newest, shiniest stuff. We should pose a question: do we really have to get tier 5 loot for rewards to be good? And the answer is absolutely not. I've spoken about this psychological component before though. One of the issues is that most players are accustomed to being able to achieve the best rewards in the game. That's thanks to systems in the past like crafting, adept weapons, enhancement, and Lootpalooza events. We've grown accustomed to being showered with the best rewards in the game relatively easily. So without a player mentality shift, a lot of people right now feel left out unless they can get the best rewards. And the psychological hook that players have for the shiniest loot and the frustration that that creates when it feels like we're locked out of those rewards, I think is one of the core things killing the mood at the moment. So to put it simply, I do think an increase in the general speed of the power climb would be a good thing when we're talking about getting up to around 400 power. And we'll talk more about power systems in a minute, but I think an even better change which Bungie could implement right now would be to offer more chances at tier 4 and 5 loot as we exceed 300 power. Obviously, I am not a systems designer, so this is just an example, but for instance, if at between 2 and 300 power, there was a low chance of getting tier 4 loot, and then at between 3 and 400 power, there was a low chance of getting tier 5 loot, I think it would create more of a carrot on a stick chase that would at least generate this sense of possibility for higher tiered rewards, right? The issue at the minute is that a lot of players get frustrated because they want higher tier loot, but we essentially know that we can't get them until we complete the initial marathon of grinding purely for power. Additionally, or alternatively, instead of power, if tiered rewards could be based more on achievement per activity, that could be a viable alternative as well. For instance, if you could complete a very difficult ops mission in any category, even if you're at 250 power, and still get a chance at tier 4 or 5 loot, it would again augment this power grind to feel like there are actual opportunities at getting the kinds of rewards we want without having to be at maximum power. And importantly, it would actually still reserve efficiently grinding for high tier loot until a bit later on in the progression path. There are lots of people as well at the moment who say, you asked for grind, Bungie gave you grind. Tier 5 rewards, for instance, should be difficult to obtain. And I agree that they should be difficult to obtain, but I actually despise the concept that all of these rewards are tied to where you are in the power band. Generally, I would prefer if actual gameplay achievement, and not just the amount that you grind in other activities, would be the primary impact on the quality of rewards that you get. Overall though, as we've discussed, Bungie definitely have options with regards to the tiered system. And going back to the start, looking at player drop right now, the reality is that Bungie need to pull those levers soon, because whether you agree or not with the general sentiment of the player base right now, if players keep leaving the game at the current rate, it's going to be good for nobody. And I think Bungie need to do things to curb that player drop off as soon as possible. So in general, up to 400 power, I think Bungie need to speed up progression a little bit. There are also other systems that I just think are stupid, like the new gear bonuses. Personally, I just don't think they need to be in the game. There is the discussion about the amount of damage increase on your weapons or damage resistance on your armor, and whether that's really massively valuable. The other component though, even when you look at reward ratings in the portal, is that to get the best ratings, you have to have both new gear and your highest power gear equipped at any given time. You can work around that by putting more difficult modifiers onto activities, but I just generally do not like the new gear concept, and I don't think it does anything really valuable for the game, with the exception of creating that hamster wheel of earning stuff, then replacing it with other stuff later on. Once you get beyond 400 power though, things get really ridiculous. At that point, we rely on these seasonal prime engrams, which have a very low drop rate. You maybe get 1 or 2 of them every hour or 2 that you play the game. And then there are the ridiculous infusion costs. I'm not personally at a power level to even know about this yet, but QJ shared, after grinding to 401 power, I decided to swap over to a different character, and it takes 7,744 unstable cores to infuse 1 piece of 200 power armor up to 401 power. So even if you have in excess of 50,000 cores, you will only be able to infuse 6 armor pieces before you run out. You'd also have to dismantle 12 pieces of 400 power gear to get enough cores to do 1 infusion. Now, I know some folks like grind, but honestly, what is that? That's just stupid. I can't imagine a world where a designer is sitting there saying, this seems like a fun mechanic. This is something that players are going to want to engage with. Honestly, I think that is fun for nobody ever, under any circumstances, ever. It's mad. And the crazy thing is that while players are mostly complaining about the grind to 400 power right now, it actually gets significantly worse beyond 400. And I've got no idea why Bungie would implement a system like that. It's just bonkers. So, of course, I don't know how quickly Bungie could implement changes that would significantly improve how this feels, but honestly, I think if Bungie increased the rate at which we can earn power, even if it's by 15 or 20%, that would make a massive difference on the power climb, but it would only really work if Bungie also introduced chances to get higher tier rewards without being at max power. I can't see why it would be a bad thing to give a 5 or 10% drop chance at tier 4 loot between 200 and 300 power, or indeed tier 5 loot at between 3 and 400 power. Players at that point have already invested a lot of time into the system. If they're playing harder and challenging content, why shouldn't there be rewards for that? To reserve all of that really high tier loot for the end of the power grind when players are ultimately done with the season, and the next thing that's going to happen is that those rewards become redundant because of the new gear system. Yeah, at the minute it's just all over the place. But as we've identified, there are ways that Bungie can improve this if they choose to do it. If they don't choose to do it, it tells us that they're dying on the hill of farming engagement from players. And as the numbers suggest at the moment, dying on that hill is quite literally what will happen if Bungie don't come up with a plan here. So that's my 2 cents. I don't think Bungie have very long before they need to have that conversation, and I sincerely hope that they will. So give me your thoughts down below. Obviously, changing power and gear tiers won't fix every problem in Edge of Fate, but I do think the portal, the power system, tiered rewards, they are a foundation that Bungie can build on, and many of these systems actually could be pretty good. I just don't think there is an option to wait 5 or 6 months before those important changes drop. So that's my thoughts. Give me yours down below. But as always, cheers for tuning in, and I hope you guys have an awesome day.